Okay, with some delay here on stage one, we will continue with Swantje Lange, and she's talking about that roaming in 5G networks can be difficult.
All right. Hi, everyone, and great that so many of you are here today. For those of you who attended the last talk, we will stay in the area of widely used wireless communication, and I will talk about why roaming agreements are the hidden attack surface of 5G. The work I will present here is joint work with Francesco, Matthias, and Jiska, and let's start right away. So first, I'm Swantje Lange. I'm a PhD student at Hasso-Plattner-Institut in Potsdam, and my work focuses on security in cellular networks. So I really like to work on all of the different components like SIM cards, rogue base stations, but I also like to look into the implementation of the protocols in the smartphones. The work I will present now examines 5G roaming, and like this, it combines a lot of these aspects. But let's start with roaming. What is roaming meant for? You know, roaming is meant for traveling, right? So to have like a nice vacation or business travel to Heidelberg. And thanks to roaming, we can only use a single device. I mean, some of you might remember the times when you had to have like a certain separate phone to go to different areas. This is not the case today. And thanks to roaming, we can also use only one SIM card, and you don't have to have a traveling SIM card. But there's also drawbacks to this. You might have the idea, yeah, roaming, that's quite nice, but the problem is that roaming also introduces complexity into the system, and like this, it opens up an attack surface for rogue base station attacks. So this is one aspect, but the other aspect is, why did we just out of the sudden started to look into roaming as a research project? When we started the project, we saw that there are quite some articles around who were talking about high-value targets getting hacked by state-sponsored actors. And by getting hacked, I mean there was some spyware found on their phones, which is not really nice. So first, who are high-value targets? High-value targets are journalists or politicians or human rights activists, which are of high value of some states. So usually those are persons in countries where democracy is not the greatest thing. And on the one side, we saw this, and on the other side, we saw that there were even reports, for example, by Amnesty Tech, just examining what spyware vendors are claiming to do. And there were vendors saying, hey, we use 3G and 4G to infect targets' phones. So we were thinking, okay, what is the issue here? What's the problem with the cellular infrastructure? How can 3G and 4G, and even 5G, be abused for such attacks? For this, we have to look into the evolution of cellular standards. The first relevant generation is 2G, as it is still around today. And in the past, 2G, or probably already up to today, 2G is commonly used for rogue base station attacks. As with 2G, it is quite easy to trick a phone into a connection. Because in 2G, only the phone has to authenticate to the network. So if the network sees the phone and the phone says, I would like to connect, and the network says, okay, then the connection is there. That's it. And on the other hand, you might ask, why do attackers want to get a rogue base station into the system? The thing is that in the cellular network, the traffic is like sent from the core network to the base station, and the base station kind of transmits it over the air to the phone. And if you have a rogue base station, you have a perfect machine in the middle because you're in this flow of traffic. And if you are a machine in the middle, you can intercept traffic or manipulate as you like. So today, you might have already realized that your current version of Android or iOS allows you to just disable 2G. So this attack surface is mitigated or at least reduced. So without having 2G as an easy entry point for the attack, attackers might take a look at 3G. And in 3G, we kind of have this feature, which I was talking about before, added. So we have this mutual authentication, which means that the network also has to authenticate to the phone. And like this, it kind of limits the easy attack surface to all the messages which are sent before the authentication. And since those messages are indeed not really interesting, attackers just turned towards the roaming system and looked into how to exploit this system. And you might have heard of those famous SS7 attacks in the past, which were a really big thing. But then there was 4G. And 4G, even the system improved a bit further. So in 4G, we had cryptographic session keys, which were really bound to one roaming network. So that means that your session keys would only be valid for the connection with this one network. So you could not do some weird key reuse attacks like this. And recently, the standard of 5G made it even more secure by adding a so-called proof of presence to the whole protocol, which means that a visited network a user is currently in has to prove to the home network that the user is really there. Before, a visited network could just claim, hey, this user is here, without this really being the case. But even with those improvements, the mechanisms of roaming and lawful interception can still be abused to spy on people, as we saw in the reports, for example. But let's look into roaming. So to understand how roaming can be exploited, we really have to first understand how roaming works. As I mentioned, roaming allows a user to authenticate with networks while they're traveling. So on the left side, you see the network the user is currently visiting, and on the right side, there is the home network the user has an active subscription with. And in a legitimate scenario, the user connects to the visited network, and this visited network is requesting the home network for a so-called authentication vector, which is required to establish this mutually authenticated connection. So for the network to authenticate to a phone to claim, hey, I am a real network. And the operators of the visited network and the home network, they have a so-called roaming agreement, which allows them to bill the user who's traveling, but also to bill each other for the traffic which was coming up there. And then in cellular networks, we have this concept of lawful interception. So lawful interception allows operators to intercept the traffic of users that are within their coverage area. This can be easily done in cellular traffic because the traffic is only encrypted during the over-the-air transmission, so only between the base station and the phone. At the base station, it gets decrypted and is transmitted in plane through the core networks. So you can really just say, okay, at the core network, I will just look into what traffic is going through, and like this lawful interception is easily possible. But in this case here, we see that the visited network can intercept the user's traffic because the user is currently in their coverage area, but the home network can only intercept or see this traffic if the traffic is home routed, so if the traffic really goes through the home network. So that's the legitimate case, how roaming usually applies and how it should work. But now let's get to the case if roaming gets abused. So in this case, we have an attacker who collaborates with the visited network. And like this, the attacker could just set up a rogue base station outside of the actual coverage area of that visited network. And like this, they could just come to Heidelberg, put up their rogue base station, and claim to be another operator from another country. And such a connection could still be mutually authenticated because the phone would connect to this base station, and the collaborating visited network would request the home network for an authentication vector. This works because the visited network is actually usually a benign network. And for the home network, it is really difficult to decide in this case if the request for the authentication vector is legitimate or not, since usually this network sends legitimate requests. And another aspect of cellular we already heard in the talk before, it's very important for operators to get money out of it. So billing is a very big issue here. And operators, if they would reject such an authentication request, they might just get a loss in revenue maybe an unhappy customer because they cannot connect if they are traveling. So it is very highly likely that the networks would just reply to such a request and the connection would get established, even with the attacker in the chain. But let's look closer at the attacker. So to abuse 5G and get to a machine-in-the-middle attack, we assume that we have an attacker who collaborates with a mobile network operator. And like this, the attacker could force the mobile network operator to provide access to the lawful interception interfaces of the operator. And yeah, this would allow the attacker to eavesdrop on the user's network traffic and phone calls and SMS. The reports of Amnesty Tech I mentioned in the beginning, they were actually really detailing that the spyware vendor Intellexa is claiming in their marketing material that they are offering rogue base station solutions which cooperate with benign operators to enable the base station to connect to the regular cellular infrastructure. So this attacker model is real, one could say. And to set up the rogue base station, the attacker can use a software-defined radio, which is attached to the operator's network. And as the network traffic can be routed globally, the attacker can be located in the same country or in a different country as the collaborating mobile network operator. So like this, the choices of available operators is pretty wide because the attacker could just go up to any operator in the world, basically. And with this setup, our attacker wants to achieve a machine-in-the-middle position. This is really effective because the communication between the phone and the base station is only encrypted over the air. And as the traffic gets decoded at the base station is a perfect machine in the middle. However, you might say, okay, I'm using internet traffic on my phone and it's encrypted by using TLS. That's true. So the attacker cannot easily look into your TLS connections. But still, they can see SMS, phone calls, and the cellular network setting up. But on the other hand, you see it's a bit limited, and we know that state-sponsored attackers, they really put an effort onto attacking their targets, so they may acquire zero-day exploits for the cellular baseband, because the idea is that exploits for the baseband are usually quite reliable, since baseband firmware, you might have seen the talk yesterday, is highly complex, and usually due to real-time requirements, it lacks basic protection mechanisms you usually find in software like stack canaries. So your attacker might acquire such an exploit, and with this, exploit the baseband chip of the phone, and through the exploit, might even make it into the operating system of the phone. And if they are there, well, they can install software or spy on the user, whatever they would like. So the machine in the middle position, in this case, can really be abused as an entry point for remote code execution. Okay, and I said we looked into this, so how did our lab setup look like? We actually used the implementation of Open5GS to set up a visited network and a home network, and then we used SRS-run as a RAN solution, and of course several phones. So on the picture here, you can see that we have like an SDR as the base station, and then some phones as target phones. And of course, a big lab PC running the cellular network, the core networks. Additionally, we had a so-called SIM-trace2, which we can use to observe the communication between the SIM card and the phone, which was also very handy. You will see it later on. And of course, we read a lot of standards, a lot of 3GPP specifications to see what is going on there and why it is going on like this. Okay, but let's start with the attack. I mean, the idea is some attacker wants to do the attack, but how can we do this without being noticed by the user? You might know on Android and iOS, there's in the status bar, you see the name of the network you are currently connected to. And if you have an Android phone, you even see this small R up here, showing that your phone is in a roaming connection. So yeah, that's a thing, the name is there, but the question is, where does this network name come from? So essentially, there are different sources for the name. First, we have the SIM card, which can store network names along with their network ID. So this network ID consists of a country code and a network code, which identifies the network within the country. And secondly, the phone itself stores such lists with network names and network IDs, for example, in their carrier bundle. But the specification assumes that those locally stored lists can be outdated, so the network provides its own update mechanism. So the network may announce its network ID along with its network display name. And from a prioritization point of view, first we take the information on the SIM card, then we take the information which is maybe sent from the network, and in the last option is to look at what is stored on the phone. Okay, so if you're now in our home network, we have the SIM card, which is issued by our home network's operator. So we have the SIM card, and the SIM card usually contains the network ID of the network operator, along with the display name there. That's easy, everything is there. But when we're roaming, we saw that usually those lists are empty in the sense that they don't contain a display name to the network we are currently in, because this would mean that you would have to have a list of all operators and all display names on your SIM card, which is not that handy. So usually in this case, we really see the name sent via the network on the phone. And here we have like a small difference between Android and iOS. So on iOS, you see only the name which is sent from the network, while on Android you see the name which is sent from the network, as well as the name which is stored on the SIM card as name of the SIM card or name of the home network's operator. And if we're now in the scenario of an attacker abusing the roaming, we could just think of an attacker who would announce the network name of the phone's home network. Because like this, we would only see the name of the home network on the UI. This would be the case for iOS as well as for Android. Because on Android, there's basically like a string matching. So if the name which is coming from the network matches the one on the SIM card, then only one is displayed since, it's basically redundant information. And the idea why this is part of the attack is that if an attacker takes a rogue base station, travels somewhere to announce some visited network outside of the coverage area of this visited network, and they are kind of visiting a user or a target which is traveling somewhere else or in their home country even, the target would not expect to see a name of another visited network of a country which is not close by. So with this attack, the attacker could really stay stealthy in a sense that the target would not be able to notice it on the UI that they are connected to a different network. So we see that the user has very limited possibilities to observe that the phone is roaming. And during the authentication process, we see that only the network ID code is sent to the home network, but not the displayed name. So the home network has no means to check if there was something else displayed to the user. I mean, the idea of this might be, it might be not interesting, right? But in case of an attack, it might be irrelevant information. And if we're targeting an Android phone, one could even hide this network, this roaming indicator in the status bar by announcing the network ID which corresponds to the network ID of the home network of the target. Because for the phone only checks if this incoming network ID is the same as the one of the home network, and if it's the same, there's no roaming indicator needed, since they assume that the phone is not roaming. Okay, but let's look into this a bit more into detail. Here I brought like a simplified version of the 5G authentication and key agreement scheme. And we really see that in the first place, the phone announces its network ID of the home network and the network ID of the visited network. This is the information which really goes through to the home network. I mean, you might be wondering why here are like two components. So in the 5G core, the core functionality is actually split up into different components. So I only put up here the components which are relevant for this authentication handshake. So we kind of have the base station here, which is like doing the over-the-air transmission. And then here, this is the component of the visited network, which is responsible for the authentication. This component is talking to the authentication function of the home network. And to really perform the authentication, the home network has to talk to this user data register where they get the key materials from, which they then need to derive session keys. So actually, using this key material in the user's database, the home network kind of creates an authentication vector and includes an authentication challenge. This is sent to the visited network, and the visited network then only forwards the authentication challenge part to the phone, and the phone has to compute a response. This is also the part which we call proof of presence, since the phone has to compute this authentication response, and if the phone is not in the visited network has no means to compute this response. And this response gets checked in the visited network as well as in the home network, and then the home network has to confirm, yes, this was a successful authentication. And then they are kind of sending the configuration update command, which also contains the network name that gets displayed on the phone. And if we're in an attack scenario, we see that we have like a malicious visited network, and they could, like this, change the information which gets transferred here. So there might be a different network name sent and different network name displayed on the phone. And I mean, this was only an abstract view, but let's look into this in a more detailed manner. And for this, I brought some Wireshark traces for you. So this is the first one here is like the connection between the phone and the base station. So only the content which gets sent over the air. And here we kind of see in the first message it's a registration request. And the phone is sending their own home network's ID here, which we see down here. It's like the mobile identity. And in the mobile identity, we have the country code and the network code. And country code and network code together kind of make up the network ID. And what we see next, since we're here on the interface between the base station and the phone, that the base station is sending an authentication challenge, which we see down here by having some random parameters and some authentication number they need for the computation. We can also look at the other interface between the two, between the home network and the visited network, so between the core networks. And here we see that the home network kind of gets the identifier of the phone and the identifier of the visited network, which is here called serving network. Okay, and you can more easily like see it here on the side. It says serving network name. So if you read the spec, you would be like, hey, the serving network name is sent to the home network. But this is actually not true. So it's not, there's a difference between serving network name and the name displayed on the phone. Because the serving network name which is sent to the phone essentially only contains the string 5G and then the network code and the country code and 3GPP network. So it only contains the network ID, but not the name which is displayed on the phone. So this is quite an important distinction to make. And then we can see that the home network is sending an authentication success, which we see down here. And so we see it was like 5G AKA, success is true, and here we again see the name of the serving network name. Yeah, so this is kind of the string value we see, but this does not correspond to what the user is seeing on their phone. Okay, and here we kind of get back to the traffic which is sent from the base station to the phone. So the base station kind of receives this authentication response. oh yeah, that was the uplink, right? And then it kind of forwards this. And after the registration is accepted, we have this so-called configuration update command, which contains the network name, which is actually displayed on the phone, which is the one down here. And there's always a distinction between the long name and the short name, but this is more like a question of the UI and where it gets displayed, actually. Okay, so let's get back to the slides. So if we have an attack, what is actually happening in the background or from a core network's perspective? So when an attacker abuses this roaming, then actually this visited network is wrongfully requesting an authentication vector. This means that the home network gets the request and has to check if this is really a legitimate request. And of course, they would only grant this request, only reply to this request, if the request is coming from a legitimate roaming partner and if they have like a roaming agreement. And as I already said, in 5G, at least the visited network has to prove that the phone is visiting in their network. But you might also already know that users are not able to observe which operators requested authentication vectors for their connections. I mean, they may just learn about it afterwards if they have some connections to foreign networks on their bill. But yeah, we all know that not all of our connections are on our bill. For example, if there's some EU roaming in place, or if it was a really short connection with not really a lot of data transferred, something like that. So in our test setup with Open5GS, we could verify that roaming partners really can request arbitrary authentication vectors. So we'd just say, hey, I need this vector, and Open5GS would happily respond and say, like, yeah, here's the data, you can establish the connection. Another aspect which can be used by an attacking network is that in a roaming connection, we have by specification 2 different ways how the network traffic can be routed. So after the authentication took place, we can either use this home routing scenario and route the traffic via the home network to the internet, or the visited network could route the traffic directly to the internet. And of course, this decision is taken by the visited network because the visited network has to decide if it sends the traffic via the home network or if it's directly contacting the internet. So the idea probably is that usually home routing is used because a visited network kind of wants to prove that a user kind of made a lot of traffic, so they better use the home routing to route it via the home network to claim, hey, this user used a lot of traffic. And we again see that in the 5G specification, usually the focus is only on billing aspects, but not on user privacy or the observability of roaming arrangements. So in this attack scenario, the attacker could just route the traffic from the visited network to the internet, and like this could stay stealthy if we think of the home network, because the home network has no clue of the traffic, since the traffic is not traversing the home network. Another aspect which kind of makes the roaming system very hard to comprehend is that, of course, network operators would need roaming agreements with operators in any other country in the world to enable billing and to enable the customers to just go there and use the network, right? However, you see, this is quite a hassle. This looks like unmanageable because it's really a big chaos. So what we actually have is that we have so-called roaming intermediaries in place. Those roaming intermediaries are instances which are there, which operators make contracts with, and like this, all of this contract management is getting easier. However, if you have such an instance in the middle, we know that all the trust relationships get more complex. And from a privacy perspective, it is very hard to understand where our data really goes to and what other operators our operator would cooperate. So for the practice, it's really important to now know how this looks like in detail. And if we now have like a visited network which might perform such an attack with a rogue base station on a user, this can look like this. So this is actually a screenshot from a report of the Citizen Lab, because the Citizen Lab is an instance which cooperates with high-value targets who got hacked. And here we have someone who kind of announced to run for president in some country, and then their phone kind of got hacked with predator spyware. And so we see that the rogue base station can inject SMS. And in this case, it is really highly likely that while the rogue base station, there was like a phishing SMS injected, which the target then accidentally clicked on and downloaded their predator implant, which is very bad because, it's really hard to detect for the user that this is not benign. And on the other hand, as I already talked about, the rogue base station can be used for baseband exploitation, which has like a similar impact on the phone. So what can we do about all of this? I mean, you think it's a roaming attack, so just turn off roaming, right? Because if you turn off roaming, your phone only connects to your home network if your home network is there. We could do this. But the problem is that if the attacker would announce themselves as the home network, so if they would pose as the home network, the phone kind of has no means to see that this is like a fake fake announcement, since the announcement or the network ID, which is like the part how the phone decides if this is like their home network or not, is sent before the authentication. So this information has to be trusted. And even if you look deeper into the core network, this doesn't really help, because we know that the core network would usually block requests from unknown visited networks. But if we have like a visited network which would pose like the home network, the home network might just accept this request. And so for the home network, it might look like a legitimate request. And in the end, such a connection might look like a legitimate and a non-roaming connection on the phone. So the phone would not see anything of the attack. And so we did this experiments with Open5JS, and it worked all fine. And Open5JS was always providing authentication vectors, even if we were saying, we are your network, please provide. But we also know that operators indeed have roaming firewalls in place. The problem about roaming firewalls is that there's no public information about it available, which is more like the security by obscurity approach, I would say. So we cannot really research it and cannot see if it makes sense, if it's secure or if it is not. So they might block such requests. We also know from operators that they might block requests if your phone is connected to a cellular tower in Germany, and 2 seconds later, your phone is requesting to be connected via a network from Malaysia, because the operators know, okay, usually you don't travel within 2 seconds from Germany to Malaysia. There might be something fishy going on. But some kind of attacks are cope with this, but some others not. So turning off roaming is apparently not a solution for this problem. I mean, as a security researcher, we always like end-to-end encryption, right? That would be so nice, just to have maybe even from one phone to the other phone an end-to-end encrypted tunnel. Because right now, you know that at the rogue base station, the traffic gets decrypted, so the rogue base station kind of has all the traffic of the phones which are currently connected to this rogue base station. And if we would have an end-to-end encrypted channel, the rogue base station could just forward some bits and bytes, but could not really see the traffic, might have difficulties with injecting some phishing SMS, and all that kind of stuff. But we also know that there's lawful interception, and lawful interception kind of bases on this kind of, we have unencrypted traffic here. So the end-to-end encryption would disable the lawful interception interfaces. And like this, we're pretty sure that law enforcement agencies would not like this idea, and because they would have to shift their operations around and would really do different things to access the mobile traffic. So they might be very skeptical about the solution. Might be not easy to push this into standards. But let's think a bit, not that big, but in small steps. So we were thinking about, okay, in TLS, in your browser, you can always see this certificate chain. Why don't we have this in the cellular network? Because for now, we know that all the trust decisions are only taken by the core networks. So our home network has to decide if a request for an authentication vector from a visited network is a benign request. And also all the roaming intermediaries involved, if they are like real and if this is like a good connection or not. So what we would like to have is just some more information visible to the user. So one could just display the information which was used to build up the trust on the UI. And it would also be a very nice small step to see the network properties of the network a user is currently connected to. Because most of you might know, you rarely see any information, you do not even see the network ID on your phone. I mean, yeah, there are some special apps you can install, but a regular user usually don't see the network ID, only like this display name, which would be maybe, or which could be already an indicator if something wrong is going on. To have such a visible trust chain implemented, this would of course require changes in the specification, because I showed you like how these authentication and key agreement works right now. There's not a lot of information, or actually almost no information about who is in the chain and who is transferring all of our traffic. So we would have to change the specification for this and also make some changes to the user interfaces of the phones to enable the users to really see this. But yeah, so apart from changing the roaming system itself, users might have different options to observe if they are in an abused roaming connection. So we could think of users using a trace routing app to see if their traffic kind of gets rerouted or if it's just taking the usual path. Secondly, there's a lot of work going on into trying to detect rogue base stations. Usually you can use apps on rooted Android devices, and they would check the signals of base stations for their physical properties. And if they have like strange bandwidth or signal strength, then this might be an indicator for a rogue base station. But also the implementation of rogue base stations, it evolves, so it's quite hard to detect a rogue base station like this. So we think that we could also try to just measure the time our authentication needs. Because if we are in a roaming scenario, there are more steps involved, since the traffic first goes to the visited network and then the home network, instead of just going to the home network. So the authentication bit might just take more time. And actually, we discussed it with people working at operators, and because we tried to make some timing measurements, and we didn't really find significant differences between roaming and non-roaming cases. So we learned that usually cellular network traffic is routed in a weird way, and it's not always taking like the straight path. So the problem is that if we use a trace routing app, yeah, it might be just a normal case that it is taking this strange path. Or this might also be the reason why our roaming authentication does not really take longer than the usual authentication to the home network. So yeah, this is kind of also not really a solution to the problem, but I mean, there must be something we could still do, right? So let's look into our users' settings. What can we as a user do? So the first thing, to minimize the risk of getting attacked by rogue base stations, is to disable 2G, because with this we at least prevent that we get easily tricked into a connection, because the network authentication is not there in 2G. And in iOS, this would mean that you would have to enable lockdown mode, which also influences the functionality of several applications, especially your web browsing activities, to increase security. So it's more like a trade-off between security and usability. And looking specifically into roaming attacks, we could say that we just turn off this automatic network selection, because like this, we lose the connection if our home network is not there, but we have to take a really conscious decision to which network we connect to. I mean, this might not be handy if you are traveling very frequently or if you are living in a bordering region, but if you're just living in one place and there's only your home network operator around usually, then this might be already an idea to reduce this attack surface. And if you have an iPhone, you could also install CellGuard, which is an app developed at our chair. And this app also focuses on the detection of rogue base stations. So the app is analyzing the connections and also the connection attempts your phone had to a base station, and using different metrics like signal strength, and also if this base station cell tower was seen before, or if it was seen by other phones. It tries to kind of detect if your phone was connecting to suspicious cells. And kind of the advantage of having something on the phone, monitoring for rogue base stations, is that you as a user could get like an instant warning about it. Because if you would have your secondary Android device, which is kind of monitoring for fake base stations, you might have it with you, yeah, that would be good. But if there are some sensors deployed somewhere, or if it would be just the operator looking at the network and trying to find rogue base stations, then yeah, it might be hard to warn the user on time. So what we saw here, we really have the problem with the roaming networks, because we see it is abused, and we also looked into it how it can be abused. So we thought, yeah, well, that's actually time for a disclosure, because we have to make people aware of this. So last year in June, we kind of filed a vulnerability disclosure at GSMA. And yeah, then we waited for a while, but GSMA was actually quite quickly to respond. So already in July, they asked to discuss this problem with us to understand what is really going on. And already in August, so 2 months after we opened up the vulnerability disclosure process, we worked on a briefing paper, which was sent around among the GSMA members, so among the operators of mobile networks. And already in August, this briefing paper was finalized and sent around. And then, yeah, they all of a sudden got back to us to ask for feedback on briefing slides they wanted to show, which we did afterwards. And this year in February, we then were allowed to present our findings at the Fraud and Security Architecture Group at GSMA, which is like only within 7 months, so that's quite fine. I would say they are really engaged in listening to us, and they really wanted to understand the problem. So in the beginning, it was a bit difficult to really get them on board, but they were really keen to drive this and make sure that all of the members are aware of this. So concluding our work on those machine-in-the-middle attacks and roaming agreements, we can say that in the roaming system, nation-state attackers may abuse 5G to get surveillance capabilities which are outside of their jurisdiction, so something abroad, above lawful interception. And the biggest challenge is actually that for our trusted home network operators, it is very difficult to decide if authentication requests are legitimate or not, because they just cannot tell by the information they get. And also, for our phones, it is very hard to see if those roaming decisions make sense or not, because we don't have any information about the trust assumptions behind the connections. And in the end, we can say that the roaming partner or the visited network can arbitrarily choose the network name which gets displayed on the phone. And like this, users can really easily be tricked into connections which they were not meant to use probably. So for the future development of cellular networks, we raised the question if this whole concept of lawful interception and unencrypted traffic should stay the same, or if it wouldn't be better to change this, because in the current state, it can be abused and it is abused. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Are there any questions here?
Hey, you mentioned this proof of presence that was added in 5G, and as I understand, that doesn't prevent this attack. But then, do you know why it was added? Like, what does it prevent?
So it actually, maybe I will just go to the slide of the protocol so that we can all see what we are talking about. So the proof of presence is kind of this part of the protocol. And the idea with this proof of presence is that the visited network, which kind of forwards the request, hey, we have some user roaming in our network, to the home network, has to prove to the visited network that the user is really there. And I assume that before there was some fraud of visited networks announcing some users being there without the user actually being there. And yeah, so I think that's mostly fraud prevention. Because what we see in the specification is that usually the main focus is on billing and preventing fraud, because this is also one of the lower layer people can agree on if they are working at an operator and if they are making standards.
Thanks for your great talk. You had a lot of creative mitigation strategies. You also talked about the TLS protects against some of the man-in-the-middle attacks. How about not just using SMS and the calls provided by 5G, but use Signal or something like that instead?
Right, that's also a very good suggestion to just not use SMS and regular phone calls, because I mean there's a lot of alternatives providing end-to-end encryption. So that's actually a really nice idea, which is also something you could really apply to your day-to-day life. And also if you have like second-factor authentication, it's better if you not use SMS, because SMS can get rerouted and then you don't get it, but somebody else might get it. The only problem we have in this whole concept of cellular networks is that even if you say, okay, we just don't use it anymore, we still have those baseband chips in our phones. And as long as the baseband chips are there, they are probably quite vulnerable because the software is so complex. As long as we have them, we have an attack surface. So yeah, it might be an idea to get also rid of this, but yeah, I'm not sure if everybody would be happy about that.
Okay, so I was wondering, maybe I also got that wrong, but so if the rogue base station basically announced my home ID so that I don't even recognize that I'm attacked, I don't really get why this isn't like raising suspicion at the actual home network, or is it the case that those values can be different? So the rogue base station sends a different network ID to me than it announces to the home network when it requests this authentication vector. Is that the case?
Yeah, so actually this is, you can think of this, that actually they are sending someone else here than sending there. And also, what I also heard when people, talking to people from operators, they say, oh yeah, at some point we saw some suspicious activity, but you know, it doesn't increase our revenue if we would look into it. So yeah, there might be something weird going on, but yeah, we don't have time to look into it.
I mean,
so, yeah.
for the next generation network, then maybe it would be a good idea for those values to be present in the cryptographic exchange later on, so that the phone at least can then detect, okay, hey, in the authentication challenge from my home network, it actually says that's a different network ID, and so it can be detected. That would be what I would expecting, but yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. So time to push this into 6G, I guess.
Okay, are there any more questions here? If not, then please, thanks Svante again. Yeah.